The United States Army, Navy, and Air Force maintain a special, intimate kind of elder-brother relationship with the armed forces of Latin America that exists with no other foreign services. These young men are students at the School of the Americas, a major instrument in the U.S. Army Southern Command's stated policy of providing strong influence, guidance, and orientation to Latin armed services.
Tiene esta visita de los Crates de Bolivia.
Major General James Alger, commander of U.S. Army forces in Latin America, recently welcomed a group of Bolivian Army cadets who were undergoing training with U.S. forces in the Panama Canal zone. The general spoke to them about their great country and its future. Actually, Bolivia is a landlocked state, population under 6 million, with a per capita income of less than 50 cents a day. Its government is headed by an American-trained Air Force general who came to power originally through a military coup. Although it's Johnson administration policy to discourage heavy weapons purchases, the student officers were sent off in buses to tour the installation and examine the modern U.S. arms on it. These are Hawk anti-aircraft missiles. The chances of Bolivia's ever getting some are slim, and of needing them even less. But for the cadets, they make an impressive display. More than 18,000 Latin American soldiers, from private to colonel, have studied here. It's the only U.S. Army school exclusively for foreigners and taught in a foreign language. To Latin American civilians who have reason historically to distrust their own armed forces and who know the power of the U.S. Army, the militaristic solidarity implied in the school's slogan has perhaps an ominous sound. It's all for one, one for all. In fact, the school's 31 courses are resolutely non-political professional training.
Todavía es posible que con el don de mando y la agresividad de un comandante.
The students here in the Command and General Staff course are pro-American. It's widely conceded that the Latin American Officer Corps is the most pro-American sector of society. How well the Officer Corps actually understands the United States, however, is another question. An American officer instructor said that almost all his students refuse to believe that in the United States, civilians really do control the military. Most important of all, the Latin military likes American equipment. These enlisted men are learning truck and jeep mechanics on U.S. Army vehicles of the type their armies use.
Que moverla hasta que este tornillo, este peno, entra en esta grieta, esta gruta que está aquí. Eso es para...
This is how the Latin American military looks on its own home ground. It totals 750,000 men, costing $1 billion a year. In the past 20 years, only 3 Latin American countries have escaped military revolutions of one sort or another. The last 4 years have seen 9 different military coups. More than half the population of Latin America today lives under military rule. By modern Cold War standards, these Brazilian tanks are old, but Brazil is buying 100 M41s from the United States. In terms of Latin America's needs, these armies seem enormous and wasteful to American civilian leaders. The Brazilian army has 92 field marshals and no potential enemy. Overhead, the Brazilian Air Force's acrobatic squadron. Its gaudily painted trainers are a propeller-driven bid to copy the American Thunderbirds or Blue Angels. Nobody ever seems to have asked whether Brazil, a country with 50% illiteracy, actually needs to spend national income to put smoke in the sky. The squadron expenditure is part of the military budget, which goes unchallenged. Still, Brazil's is moderate as military dictatorships go. There's no veil over the military rule in neighboring Argentina, where last summer officers installed General Juan Carlos Onganía as military president. The ousted civilian president, Elia, described the officers who replaced him as starting life as Nazis, becoming Peronists, transforming themselves into anti-Peronists posing as legalists, and finishing up as anti-legalists. The Argentine armed forces are the prototype of the political military. In an apparent bid to court the United States, Argentina's new rulers said that the previous civilian government was corrupt and soft on communism. The army hasn't fought a war since 1870, but has toppled 4 civilian governments since 1945. The tradition of military influence in politics is as old as the style of these uniforms. It began with the revolutionary armies that rebelled against Spain and then refused to disband. They transformed themselves into a caste, separate from the rest of society, superior to it rather than its servant. There is prestige, influence, and power undreamed of in the United States. This factory making electric cables and copper products belongs to the Argentine Army and produces goods for sale on the civilian market. It's one of a dozen Argentine military factories, turning out such unwarlike goods as telephones and radios. Apologists for Army rule sometimes suggest that in Latin America, the military is superior to civilians in getting things done. The degree of efficiency in this military factory, however, leaves room for doubt. Not efficiency, but stalwart anti-communism is the most frequent defense of the military in politics. One of President Kennedy's closest advisors on Latin America, former President Jose Figueres, has fought actively both against Castro and right-wing dictatorships. He describes the so-called arms requirements of Latin countries as a great waste.
We're very short of development capital, and probably all or most of the resources that have been spent in arms should really go to development or to education or to public health.
A lot of people think that the military here forms a great bulwark against communism. What do you think?
I do not think so. This is a superficial political concept. Communism has been discredited in Latin America by the Cuban experiment, and all we really need is a good police to check these small groups that call themselves guerrillas or terrorists. Some people say that the Catholic Church and the military are the only real permanent Latin American institutions. As always, this may be a partial truth, but I do not believe that we can fight communism militarily, or exclusively militarily.
This boatload of doctors represents an operation of the Latin American military blessed by all departments of the U.S. government. It's military civic action, a concept promoted by President Kennedy of using the military to benefit civilian populations economically and socially. These are Panamanian and U.S. military doctors who come to the San Blas Islands off the coast of Panama to treat the primitive Indians who live there. With the medical team is Colonel Jack Brown, who commands the 3rd Civil Affairs Detachment, a U.S. Army unit charged with helping Latin American armies use their military hardware to build civilian roads, schools, and public works, and to aid civilian economic and social development wherever possible. The idea behind Army doctors treating shark bite victims, TB cases, and other Indian ailments is that these people will become friends of the Army in case one day of guerrilla insurrection and provide intelligence and help. Some Latin armies have accepted the civic action concept. Others reject it as beneath their military dignity. The United States does not discourage all heavy arms purchases. Last year, Brazil bought 5 C-130 air transports from the United States. Nevertheless, there seems to be a basic lack of military realism about relations between U.S. and Latin armed forces, as this joint air and naval exercise showed. Units from the United States, Brazil, and Uruguay were practicing the hunt for submarines in the South Atlantic. The biggest ship in the operation was a Brazilian aircraft carrier. This ship almost caused a civil war between the Brazilian Air Force and Navy a couple of years ago, when the two services were fighting over which one would control the ship's planes. The Air Force won, which is perhaps a good thing in view of the Navy's performance. It ran the carrier aground twice shortly thereafter, while at Buenos Aires on an official visit. It's inconceivable that Latin American navies would have any real role in wartime. But in the training exercise, a Brazilian admiral commanded. Overall, U.S. relations with the Latin armed services present a confused picture of tangled objectives. Most of Latin America's weapons, techniques, and organization come from the United States. But ours is a non-political army, and this is a highly political environment. American instructors are helping to create more professional armies in Latin America. But the question remains, what for? An Argentine lieutenant colonel finished his command course with the Americans some time ago and was so successful that the U.S. Army invited him to remain another year as a guest instructor. When the second tour was over, the Argentine officer returned to his country. He then joined an Army plot that the State Department was desperately trying to head off, to overthrow the elected government and install a military dictator. As one U.S. officer here put it, in our courses, we always steer clear of politics. Tom Streithorst, NBC News, Latin America correspondent.